Hey everyone, the Consummate Shill here, and what I have for you today is a deep dive into a game that I've been excited about for quite some time now. So join me as we take an extensive and in-depth look into the good, the bad, and everything in between in Greedfall. Greedfall is advertised as an open-world, story-rich, action-adventure fantasy RPG with deep character customization and a true choices matter experience. The game was developed by Spiders and published by Focus Home Interactive. Spiders is responsible for a few other games including The Technomancer, Mars War Logs, and Bound by Flame. I can't speak on the quality of their previous titles as I don't have any experience with them, but Mars War Logs seem to be the best received out of the three according to players, while the other two are somewhat varied in terms of their popularity and reception. My peers that have experience with their previous titles conclude that Greedfall is far and away their best work to date. Now, my opinions of the different aspects of the mechanics and the world design in this game during my playthrough were a roller coaster of ups and downs, back and forth from love to hate to love again and back countless times. The story for me was undoubtedly the crown jewel of Greedfall, as it never failed to impress and it kept me thoroughly engaged and emotionally involved. But we have a lot to talk about regarding some of the decisions that were made outside of the game's remarkable story. So sit back, relax, and enjoy yourselves as we explore why, after 50 plus hours of ups and downs, Greedfall still easily managed to impress and put a smile on my face by the time the credits rolled. I'll start by elaborating more on why I feel so strongly about this game's story and narrative style. Greedfall as a narrative is a tangled web of exploration, expansion, diplomatic strategies, politics, lies, deception, betrayal, murder, wolves disguised as lambs, and the snakes in the grass that you would never expect are plotting against you in your missions and goals. Downright dirtbag weasels that lie, cheat, steal, deceive to get what they want. There are issues with your own team of companions and concerns of theirs that need dealt with, expectations of superiors and other factions demand your attention and can't be taken lightly. You need allies in this world, and you get the feeling of being the sole facilitator that's going to bring these people together if anyone is going to be able to prosper in this new world. In terms of a complete and fleshed out story that allows you to become engaged, this game has it all. Now, more specifically, you play the role of Desarde. You're a nobleman of the merchant congregation, which is one of the many factions in the game world. Your cousin, Constantine, has just been named governor of the merchant congregation city on Tier 4D, which is an island that's been recently settled by a few other factions, including your own. Tier 4D is also home to a faction of more primitive people who are native to the island. The entire story revolves around the Malachor, which is a terrible disease that has stricken your people and others alike in your homeland. You've been dispatched as legate to Constantine, which is basically a deputy of sorts to the governor. You aim to set sail to Tier 4D to explore this vast, uncharted island's wilderness and hopefully discover a cure for the Malachor that's plagued your people. You'll meet key individuals of each faction along the way as well that eventually become companions that will fight and explore alongside you, each with their own personalities, varying opinions, attitudes, and personal missions and goals. As I mentioned, your efforts will revolve around your ultimate mission of ending this plague, but the journey towards that goal takes you on a massive expedition throughout the island and puts your diplomatic skills, combat tactics, and general guile to the test as you deal with the many difficulties of achieving a very improbable goal in a hostile world with very, very different groups of people. Everything comes together in the end and sets the scene for a maybe slightly rushed, but truly very good ending. The entire narrative and most loose ends are tied together at this time as well, and I was plenty satisfied with the conclusion of the story as a whole. Now, structure-wise, Greedfall is structured like many RPGs you've played. If you're experienced with the genre, you'll feel right at home with the customization and mechanical systems in the game. That's not to say it's a cookie-cutter copy-and-paste RPG, far from it actually, but there are some familiar things at work here. Reputation and relationships with each of the game's factions and companions are important, and you'll juggle those throughout your entire playthrough. The game has one main story quest that sometimes splits off into a couple concurrent quests. There are side quests galore throughout the handful of cities in the game world as a whole. You can choose to do as many or as little as you like. There are a few sort of wanted poster quests that you can pick up in random settlements that require you to do basic tasks like animal or bandit extermination. You can save the game at any time you like, which is often perceived as a good thing, but I know some of you with that harder core mentality, you'd prefer more risk and strictness when it comes to the frequency of saves. Personally, I prefer the way Greedfall decided to structure its game saves. It allows you to pick the game up and put it down immediately, and I value that in a game. Travel-wise, there are campfires littered throughout the world and what I would call navigation totems, I guess, in settlements out in the wilderness. You also have a residence in each of the 3 cities that's essentially a glorified campfire. Ultimately, you can fast travel to any of these locations at any point in time once you've visited them once on foot. You'll have several equipment slots, including your common fare of varying melee weapons, firearms, magical rings that act as weapons for the mage playstyle, amulets, and a modest amount of armor slots that cover the essentials. Your companions will also have slightly less inclusive equipment options, but enough that you can still kit them out in your own preferred and unique way. Traps, potions, and ammunition all fall under the alchemy skill set. These items can be looted or crafted and have a huge impact on the game's combat. We'll have much more on science and alchemy later on. Merchants are actually pretty limited in the game. Aside from a few areas out in the wild, the main cities and your camp in between travel are where you're going to be doing the vast majority of your wheeling and dealing. You'll have a pretty nice skill tree for customizing your abilities, various attributes to allocate, and talents to choose. Skills, attributes, and talents are all separate categories that you'll spend points in as you accrue them, and those points will be earned at varying rates. The in-game menus are pretty well done and provide you with most of the information and tools you need to navigate the world and make sense of all the content you come across. There's a codex that logs all the characters and beasts and crafting materials you encounter, as well as a section that explains most of the mechanics and systems at work in the game. The codex also keeps track of quests, side quests, and missions in a pretty well organized fashion. Reputation is one of the larger items of importance in the game, and your relationship with each faction and companion will be very fluid and ever-changing. The relationships of the factions and companions are 2 separate entities, even though each companion will have a corresponding alignment with a certain faction. Improving or worsening your relationship with a particular faction could indirectly affect your relationship in a positive or negative way with a companion and vice versa. You can spend a fair amount of time guessing the possible outcomes of the decisions you make and how each decision is going to reflect on you in the eyes of your companions or other factions. Sometimes I was correct in my theories of how my decisions would be received, and sometimes I was wrong. Your companions and these factions' leaders really have minds of their own and sometimes are impossible to predict. Honestly, I really love this aspect of the game. Unpredictability of the thoughts and actions of the characters in the game really kept me on my toes and guessing, and it really blows your mind when you think you have something completely figured out and it blows up in your face. As far as quests go, I believe companion quests are the only ones that require certain reputations to unlock. This may be true for some quests you'll obtain from certain cities or settlements, but I never noticed that being the case. As your relationship improves with a given companion, they'll start to confide in you and request help with various different things they're trying to accomplish. Sometimes these quests will fall sort of parallel with the main story, and sometimes they're completely different and turn into a personal mission that's completely separate from your main goals. As your relationship continues to improve with your companions, you can also apparently develop a romantic relationship with them. This is what I've heard, so I can't confirm or deny this, but I attempted to accomplish this on multiple occasions with high reputation with multiple companions, and I've come to the conclusion I just don't have what it takes conversationally to bang one out in the 17th century. And one more thing before we move on, I only noticed a couple instances later on in the game where my reputation or lack thereof affected the story in a major way. This could have just been how the story was going to play out anyway, but it seems to me that you have a few decisions to make later in the game, and your standing with certain factions will have an influence on how they decide to proceed with some of the larger events in the game.
May the shadow engulf our enemies! Let's see if you can ward off this fate! May the shadow engulf our enemies!
Now, I like to go over combat early on in my videos because if you're like me, the combat in an RPG like Greedfall has to at least be somewhat enjoyable if I'm going to sink my time into it. It doesn't have to be spectacular or Game of the Year quality combat, but it does have to be intuitive and able to hold my attention. Greedfall's combat falls into 3 major categories: melee combat with customization in the warrior tree, firearms and trap combat with customization in the tactical tree, and magic and spell combat with ways to customize in the magical tree. Now, before I get into these different ways to play and specialize your character, do note that I use the term customize loosely. If you decide to go full-on melee, full-on tactical, or full-on magical, you will completely fill out each of those skill trees if you're simply loading all your points into a single branch of the tree well before you finished your playthrough. While those are all fine ways to play, and you can complete the game with any of those 3 methods, that isn't how I would advise playing the game, and we'll get into why right now. You can respec a fair amount of times with items called memory crystals in this game that drop off the more powerful enemies you'll encounter. You only get 1 early on, so make sure the skills that you choose to start the game with are something that at least interests you, and save your experimenting for later on in the game. Now, having said all that, I feel the best way to get the most out of the combat styles in the game is to build your own unique hybrid character with the skills you feel will mesh together well and that you'll have fun with. There are no best builds in this game in my opinion. Some paths are clearly better than others, but as I said before, you can complete the game handily with really any skill build. Personally, I started down the tactical path in the beginning. I went through the firearms tree first, followed by traps, then on to one-handed blade weapons, and from there I filled out the remainder of the higher end skill choices as I saw fit. Also, another note, there are 4 difficulties in this game: easy, normal, hard, and extreme. And I started on hard difficulty, bounced around between hard and extreme throughout half my playthrough, and proceeded to finish the latter half of the game on extreme. In my opinion, if you're an experienced RPG player, playing this game on anything less than hard difficulty is going to be boring for you, unfortunately. The game was pretty easy on hard difficulty, aside from a few of the tougher battles in the mid-game, and on extreme difficulty, after I got my party rolling, the only challenges I felt like I faced were in the final several hours of the game, and a select few fights with high numbers of enemies throughout the game. So, anyway, I went down the tactical tree first with a focus initially on firearms. I trained my accuracy attribute, bought a decent gun, and I was off to the races. I was shocked at how effective just using your gun was. You can stand back and blast down enemies on the battlefield in a way that would make John Wick jealous. This is the point I started to question whether or not I just discovered the best way to play the game, or it was just trivial when it came to combat. Well, unfortunately, the combat is trivial on anything lower than hard difficulty, at least for me it was. Hard ramps it up a bit, but fights do feel rather easy still, and extreme ramps it up a bit more, but the same feeling of triviality exists in many places. Now, this doesn't mean the combat isn't fun, because it is, but with all the tools at your disposal, they're all just so powerful, and when you start to combine them in intelligent ways, it's all just egregiously overtuned, with your enemies being undertuned. Magic as a style takes it a step further beyond firearms as far as how powerful it is. Magic cuts right through armor for the most part, and magic-resistant enemies are few and far between. Even the magic-resistant enemies are no match for a mage with magic potions. The potions basically give you an endless supply of mana if you're willing to craft them or buy them. There is a skill in the magic tree called stasis as well. It's the first skill you get in the tree. It essentially works like a stun, with the caveat that if the enemy takes damage, the stasis is interrupted. Anytime you feel overwhelmed, you can put as many enemies into stasis as you like, and it lasts a very long time. To make things even crazier, the big skill deeper into the magic tree does this in grand AoE fashion, allowing you to put most of the enemies on the battlefield into stasis while you blow them up one by one. I used a respec and built a mage after experimenting with what firearms and traps had to offer, and again, it was fun to play, no doubt, but it was just a bit ridiculous how powerful you are in comparison to your enemies. If you're ever having trouble in this game, just respec to mage, use stasis, and the absurd damage to your advantage. Now for melee, this is the most fun way to play by far in my opinion. It's not as crazy in terms of ease and safety as the other 2 paths I've mentioned, but is by far the most fun. You can play a one-handed blade style, one-handed heavy weapon style, two-hand long blades, or two-hand heavy weapons. Each weapon type has its own unique set of skills, so the weapon you choose will ultimately determine what types of attacks you'll be using. The heavy weapons typically do more armor damage, and as you advance through the tree, you'll get bonuses to armor damage and chance to stun your enemies. The blade weapons alternatively focus on attack speed and larger cleaving attacks for the long blades. Now, each of the one-hand weapon types were relatively equal in power, and both were pretty fun to use. Two-hand heavy weapons were pretty good too, and if you get a big hammer, big mace, whatever, with big armor damage, you can shred the armor from your enemies like butter. But the clear winner here is two-hand long blades. The cleaving, or mowing as the game calls them, those attacks with these swords cleave everything in what seems to be a 180-degree radius in front of and beside you. Even seem to catch enemies behind you that are close by sometimes. All attacks in the game build fury, and as your fury meter fills up, you're able to spend that resource on stronger attacks. Fury generation and spending are going to be your bread and butter in most fights. You can augment how quickly you generate Fury with skill point allocation and some alchemy potions. Fury works the same way for spellcasting. In the end, my build was based around two-hand long blades, firearms, and the defensive spells in the magic tree. This offered the most variety and fun for me. The playstyle consisted of buffing myself and companions in the beginning of a fight, using a high fire rate pistol with a focus on armor damage to soften them up, and then wreaking havoc with cleaving attacks. Coupled with potions that buff combat attributes, this was also an insanely strong build. Also, I forgot to mention, traps are also located within the tactical tree and are somewhat clunky but extremely powerful tools. You have poison, magical, elemental, and stasis traps at your disposal, and yes, the stasis trap does exactly what the magic stasis skill does, but albeit slightly more difficult to use until you gain the ability to throw your traps. There are also skill points you can invest in that allow you to apply any of these previously mentioned traps to your weapons with 4 or 6 charges per application, depending on how many points you've invested. Applying stasis to your weapon is completely ridiculous. It freezes your target in place after every attack with seemingly no diminishing returns whatsoever, and after it wears off, you can immediately replace it with another application. Now this would get expensive after a while, but you can cheese any boss in the game like this, and it's a bit laughable, really. I'm not sure what the hell they were thinking, allowing a lot of these skills to trivialize all the hard work and effort they put into all this content. So on to your companions. You can have 2 companions with you at any given time, and each has their own unique skill sets and weapon types. So you choose which 2 you want, outfit them with gear, and then that's pretty much it. All of this other stuff can be pretty much overlooked, but you have no, and I repeat, no control over your companions in battle whatsoever. If the AI was superb, I wouldn't mind as much, and it's fine the majority of the time, really, but sometimes your companions can be downright f***ing dumb. Oftentimes you'll see ranged companions run up to an enemy that does loads of melee damage and basically execute themselves within 10 seconds of beginning the fight. I'm not going to spend too much time on this topic because it is what it is, but they missed an opportunity here to make the combat much more interactive and complex. If they were dead set on running exclusively AI companions, they should have spent a little more time improving said AI. Now I'm not saying the companions are bad because they're actually pretty helpful in most scenarios, but it's just mind-boggling how they were implemented. One saving grace is there's an alchemy consumable that revives your companions during battles, and it's pretty cheap to craft, but in the end, even if your companions suicide 10 seconds into the fight, you can still win any fight pretty handily. Aggro. The aggro range is fine in the game, and there's a slow ramp up of music that starts when you're approaching aggressive enemies. I was fine with this, but I've heard some people getting aggravated that they say it cheapens the experience because it essentially alerts you when you're approaching danger. I never really felt this way, but I thought I should mention it anyway. Sneaking is also a mechanic that allows you to bypass fights you don't want to engage in or nail surprise attacks that can be beneficial and even in the odds of a fight. You can go undetected through multiple sneak attacks, and it works pretty well. It's okay. But the last thing I want to touch on, combat-wise, and it's one of the most unforgivable errors I see in game development, aggro dropping. What do I mean by that? Well, you can approach this group of enemies, stand at the maximum safe distance, take one step in, aggro the whole group, then take one step out, and the entire group will reset and run back to their original positions. Now, big deal, who cares, right? Well, no. This game requires mobility and a lot of movement during combat, and if you happen to take one step outside of this imaginary line drawn for the aggro range of a group of enemies, they'll all instantly reset, health, armor, everything, and it really ruins any kind of immersion you'd feel in combat when it happens. Eventually, you do get used to this and become more careful about these artificial boundaries, but for me, it really feels like shit when it happens, and it immediately begs the question again, what in the hell were they thinking? So I edited this part in because it seems like I always think of a few extra things after recording. There's a tactical pause feature in the game, and I'm shocked I forgot to include it. It's essentially an entirely different way to play the game than what I've described. You can press the spacebar by default and freeze the action in place at any time during combat, and during this tactical pause you can select any attack, spell, technique, or potion at your disposal, including the dodge mechanics. Now, to use this tactical pause for every action during combat would be just tedious and frankly just inefficient and unnecessary. I found it useful to weave in skills that I either ran out of hotkeys for, or just things that I didn't use often enough to warrant hotkeying, such as companion resurrection consumables. Also, something I'd like to add concerning the narrative of the story. This game hits pretty hard on some social and political issues throughout, and then you can really see some parallels when you compare some of the issues in the story to some issues we and other countries are facing or have faced in the past. I'm not going to turn this into a political or moral discussion, but suffice it to say that the elephant in the room is larger nations moving to a new world and impeding on the natives of the new land's way of life, even going so far as torturing, killing, and displacing tribes of people for personal gain. Now, does that sound like a story you've heard before? Now, moving on to quests, the main story quest line is truly phenomenal. I already sang my praises for how well I think they did with the story, so I'd just like to touch on a little more specifically what you'll be doing as far as questing goes. Aside from a few wanted poster sort of collection quests, the quests in this game are going to be a breath of fresh air for you. It really seems like spiders sat around a table and came up with every idea that's been done concerning repetitive, boring, mundane quests and put them all on a list of what not to include in this game. Most all quests just feel right with the flow of the story, and side quests do well to either accentuate the main story or provide you with meaningful content relating to your past, another faction, or one of your companions. Some quests will seem simple enough and you think it's going to be bing bang boom 5 to 10 minute quests, and 3 hours later, through a series of twists, turns, and inexplicable chaos, you're left with your jaw on the floor trying to piece together what the f just happened and trying to figure out why you didn't see it coming. Quest to quest, it really is a roller coaster of emotions. Now, there is some errand boy feeling quests in this game. Sometimes, you'll get a quest that requires a lot of courier work and you'll feel like some horseshit middleman. It's just running back and forth between different people. These are annoying enough that I felt the need to mention them, but it's not overdone to a point where it's going to detract from your experience. Now, the game world. First of all, this is not an open world game in the sense that The Witcher 3 or Skyrim is an open world game. This game has a large world broken down into several handfuls of semi-linear zones. Portions of these zones will be wide open, while there's often narrow pathways that have to be taken to get to different areas within that zone or connecting zones. One cosmetic issue I've seen is occasionally you'll see a pretty intrusive zone wall that seems like it could be backed off on quite a bit. These are few and far between, and they aren't really a big deal, but they're pretty cruddy when you see them in action. I mentioned campfires and the sort of navigation totems before and how you can fast travel to and from any of these places whenever you'd like. To elaborate a little more on that, each time you fast travel, you stop off at a little sort of camp that works as a midpoint between locations. At this midpoint camp, you'll have all the amenities you would at the campfire location, including a crafting bench, the ability to swap companions in or out of your current party, and the option to sleep to pass time through the day-night cycle of the game world. The one thing you get in these midpoint areas that you don't get at regular campfires is a merchant. And this is an important variable because, as I stated before, merchants in this world are few and far between unless you're in one of the major cities. There's also a bit of Metroidvania-style progression here and there, requiring you to backtrack to new places and old zones that were previously inaccessible. Now, the game world is done very well. With a, quote, AA developer budget, Spiders were really able to get a lot of bang for their buck in terms of graphical quality. It's not the best you've ever seen, but everything looks right for the period, and the wildernesses are truly beautiful and well done. Character models and beasts are well done for the most part, and the animations that follow are good too. The music, even though a little repetitive at times, it's fantastic. The ambient sounds of the world are incredible, and the combat sound effects are of high quality as well. One thing that really stood out to me are the sounds of the guns in this game. Holy Christ, do you get a sense of kaboom when you're firing off these black powder guns. The bassy, chest-thumping bangs into a puff of smoke that even sometimes knock enemies off balance or to the ground really are an experience in and of themselves. You'd be doing yourself an extreme disservice to miss out on the guns in this game. Variety-wise, though, a ton of assets in this game are recycled and reused. Every occurrence of a particular type of beasts are going to look identical, which, it's fine for the most part. I can understand animals looking the same, and I'm fine with that. But Many faces of the characters you'll meet through the game are clearly and sometimes just plain laughably reused to the point where two different characters could easily pass as twins. This wasn't such a big deal for me, and I was even able to look past this. However, the worst example of this is with the main palaces in each of the 3 main cities. They are all exactly the same. 3 different factions, 3 different cultures, 3 completely unalike-minded groups of people somehow built 3 stone for stone, board for board, door for door, same f***ing buildings. I mean, Jesus Christ. Even this could be forgiven, but you spend so much time in these buildings, it really started to bother me, even to the point where I'm shaking my head in disbelief every time I enter one of the palaces. Guys, I understand. AA developer, they can't deliver all the huge, expensive, beautiful assets with their budget, but skimping on the buildings you return to countless times throughout the entirety of the game, maybe not the right place to save a buck. It's just an egregious and careless oversight, in my opinion. Okay, attributes. You get an attribute point, I believe, every 3 levels. There's 6 attributes for you to allocate your points to, and each attribute caps at 5 points. As your equipment gets better, it'll begin to have higher attribute requirements in order to equip. Strength increases armor damage, quality of stuns. Agility increases physical damage and fury generation. Mental power improves magic damage and fury generation. Endurance increases health and balance. Accuracy increases the damage and armor damage of firearms and traps. And willpower increases your mana and magic effect duration. All of these attributes work towards point checks for higher quality gear as well, so in order to use higher quality pieces of equipment, you'll need to improve with the corresponding attribute. Strength for heavy weapons, agility for swords, mental power for rings, endurance for armor, accuracy for firearms, and willpower for amulets. Talents are a separate tree with separate points that are accrued at the same rate as attributes, albeit offset by 1 level. Charisma reduces merchant prices and increases the success of certain dialogue options. Interestingly enough, I enjoyed having lower charisma for dialogue, to tell you the truth, because it caused more variance and chaos during the quests. Vigor allows you to traverse certain types of terrain and allow you to access areas that you'd otherwise not be able to get to. It also increases your maximum ammo capacity and allows health and mana regeneration outside of combat. Craftsmanship allows you to craft upgrades on your armor and weapons. You'll be upgrading your armor infrequently enough that I found craftsmanship really to be a waste, because you can just pay a blacksmith with a modest fee to craft the highest level upgrades for you. Keep in mind though, there are a couple quests that require level 1 craftsmanship. Lockpicking allows you to simply pick locks on doors and chests, which is very useful early on, but kind of falls out of favor later in the game. It also allows you to disarm and recover traps. Intuition makes materials in the wild easier to see by placing sort of a gold particle effect on them. It also increases the amount of materials gathered and unlocks additional dialogue options. And finally, science, probably the most overpowered feature of the game. Science allows you to craft potions, ammunition, and alchemical preparations, which is just a fancy word for traps. It also allows you to bypass blockages and weak walls in the game. The steroids that some of these potions give you really take your character to an out-of-control level. They're cheap and they're extremely good. Health and mana potions are also cheap to the point you'll never run out if you're consistently looting and gathering materials. They're consumed quickly in battle and have no cooldown, so you essentially have an endless supply of life and mana as well. Science is also the best way to stock up on ammunition. The ingredients are cheap, and every combination yields 5 ammunition at Science level 3, which is insane if you're using your guns often. The alchemical preparations are also very good, and you should be using them in some form or another in every build you play. It can't be overstated how valuable this talent is. Also, if you're planning on utilizing what Science has to offer, it's a good idea to take at least 1 point in Intuition to make materials easier to spot in the wild. Since I've already touched on the skill tree many times, I'll just say that it's not the most extensive skill tree I've ever seen, but it works well, and you can create a diverse assortment of builds that feel unique. Certainly enough to keep the game fresh throughout a playthrough. You gain 1 skill point per level, and there's also numerous skill point shrines scattered throughout the wilderness for you to discover and acquire. As far as statistics on equipment go, it's all pretty simple for the most part. Weapons and rings have a damage value, an armor damage value, a stun value, a fury generation value, and a stat named Attack Cost Furious. Not sure why they named it that because it's confusing, but the value is a percentage, and whatever this percentage is determines how much of a total fury bar it will take for 1 furious attack. So For example, if the value is 25%, it'll take 25% of a Fury bar for 1 Furious attack. In other words, you would have a total of 4 Furious attacks saved up if you fill up an entire bar of Fury. So possible values, in my experience, were 25% for 4 Furious attacks, 33% for a total of 3, 50% for a total of 2. And the former statistics are pretty self-explanatory. Amulets are simple. They have mana regen with resists or minor spell effects, or they have health regen with resists. Armor is part simple and part so ambiguous it'll leave you wondering if you're a total moron or you've missed an explanation somewhere. There is a raw armor value on all armor pieces that, from how I understand it, just does a flat damage reduction of that value. The other stat is balance, which can only be described as inexplicable until you raise the stat to a point where you realize what its benefits are through experimentation and combat. I didn't even realize what the stat did until I respec to a melee build and started wearing heavier armor. What it appears to do is the higher your total balance is, the harder it is for you to get stunned and knocked back and knocked down in combat. This is my theory though, as I've searched high and low in the game codex and elsewhere for an explanation, and I've really come up with nothing other than my own assumptions. Armor can also have resistances, and chest armor can have +1 to various talents, which that's extremely valuable. These talent bonuses can be crafted as well. Also, something I forgot to mention with companions, when you raise your reputation with a particular companion, they'll have a corresponding talent buff you gain when they're in your party. For instance, Kurt, the companion you start with, when you raise your reputation with him to friendly and he's in your party, you'll receive a +1 bonus to craftsmanship. Also, you won't need to have any points invested for this system to work either. It'll take your skill from 0 to 1, which, as I mentioned before, craftsmanship isn't that great in my opinion, so you can invest 0 points into it, and as long as you're friendly with Kurt, you can just slap him into your party when the quests that require craftsmanship skill come along. The same goes for other companions. And once again, I get the feeling I've rambled on long enough here, but that's about as good as I can do for a full outline of what to expect with Greedfall. In the beginning, my thoughts on the game were so up and down that I didn't know what to think. I had flashes of, man, I love X about this game, to, wow, Y is terrible, what the hell were they thinking, back to, holy shit, this is awesome, back down to, good lord, who is making these decisions? And I gotta tell you, even with all the flack and criticism I've given this game, I still think the positives far outweigh the negatives. This really is a good game, and one of the best I've played this year, and this game's narrative is quite possibly one of the best I've ever played through, period. It really is that good. I've had to bite my tongue several times here to avoid spoilers because I really wanted to convey how good the story is. When the game would fall and I'd get down on something that annoyed me, it would bug me for a short period of time, and then the story would pick the game back up, hoist it onto its shoulders, and carry it through till the bittersweet end. And what a bittersweet ending it was. So, retail, this game is $50 US. I got it on sale for $40 at launch. I think it's worth every penny. So, if you think the game looks cool and you're interested in playing it, I would definitely recommend picking it up. If you're a big-time RPG fan and enjoy a great story, it really is a no-brainer. I see some people claiming 20 to 25 hour playthroughs, and either they rushed the main story quest and skipped most everything else, or they just didn't finish the game. Now, I've logged over 50 hours in this game, and now granted, I did every side quest and companion quest in the game, but I don't think that would explain the disparity. Even skipping several side quests and companion quests, you're still have to be looking at 40 plus hours for a playthrough easily if you're actually digesting the dialogue and getting involved with the story, which you absolutely should be. This game is evidence that you don't need a AAA budget to produce a fantastic RPG experience. I mean, sure, you see the smaller budget reflected in some aspects of the game, but those things don't condemn it, not even close. So that's all I have for you today. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. It's been definitely a bit windier than my previous reviews. I hope you enjoyed this review, and hopefully you learned something today about Greedfall. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content and you'd like to see more content like it for other games, and let me know what you thought about the video in the comments or what you'd like to see in the future. Thanks for watching.
Move away! Things are about to get dicey!